Welcome to Cheese in Depth. I'm Michael Landis, and today I have Zoe Brickley with me, and we're going to talk about 4 of her special cheeses, but also talk a little bit about Jasper Hill.
If you're tasting along at home, if you have the tasting kit, Harbison is the first cheese that we're going to try. Here it is. It's a bloomy rind cheese. So Brie is the most popular bloomy rind cheese, just like champagne is the most popular sparkling wine. So bloomy rinds is the family name, and it has that name because these white soft rinds literally bloom as they develop. You can see we also have some blooms of blue and gray and green molds on the outer edge, and what that is actually a spruce bark strip. So you can see I'm able to peel back that spruce bark. I like to kind of keep that on there. I'm just going to kind of tuck that back because the spruce bark, it's kind of a different medium. It grows these sort of more varied flora in the same family as the fluffy white stuff. But these we call it flora. It's a more marketable term than fungi or mold, which is also what it is. But these microflora bloom and grow on the surface. They soften the cheese as it over time. So the cheese starts out kind of like rubbery and firm, and as that rind grows, so as I mentioned, the rind as it grows is softening the cheese. So it starts out firm, then it gets softer. And so the spruce bark strip is an old Jura Mountain tradition. And somebody figured out that if your cheese gets really soft as it ripens and it starts to puddle and fall apart, that you can wrap it with the spruce bark strip. It's kind of the inner layer of the spruce tree. And I have a short video I can show of actually that harvest process going on. But it makes a natural dish. It not only helps flavor the cheese, but it helps hold it together as it ripens. And so actually what you end up with is like a little bowl that you can peel back that top rind and just scoop out that gooey center. Really beautiful. And as this cheese ripens, it gets more flavorful and interesting and rich. So you get garlicky, cauliflower, roasted vegetable flavors. Sometimes it's mushroomy. That white flora growing on the surface is actually related to like a white button mushroom, and you get those kinds of earthy flavors from it. So this is a great example of a cheese that's kind of iconic for Jasper Hill now. And the spruce bark gives it almost like a woodsy, mustardy, je ne sais quoi, a little bit more complexity and depth of flavor. So it's sort of a multi-purpose treatment there. So let's see, I've got.
So what would you pair with this?
Oh gosh, Harbison is lovely with any beverage that has a nice amount of acidity and that has seen a barrel. So Chardonnay is the first thing that comes to mind, or any other even oak-aged beers, especially Saison styles that are oak-aged that have that kind of brightness, and then have spent some time in a barrel. Even bourbons can be lovely because they have that kind of that richness that the barrel imparts, and that spruce bark plays really nicely with the barrel. Also, it's just wonderful with a crusty baguette, anything that you can sort of get in there and scoop and enjoy it with. And you can see here, this is the bark harvesting process. So there's a man named Ron, and he spends his time in the woods harvesting these bark strips. So he's using that double-handled knife, scraping off the rough outer bark. And then he has a very special tool. It's 2 X-Acto knives taped together with a little spacer. So he gets the right width every time, and he runs that along the edge of the log. And you get what's called the cambium layer, the inner bark layer. It's flexible. You can peel it right off the tree, turn it into strips, and then we rubber band it onto the edge of the wheels, as you can see in the 3rd panel there. So a really unique process. You're starting to see that bark wrapped soft cheese style pop up more and more with more American producers, which is, it's kind of exciting. The category is growing. So keep your eye out, especially for those. So one of the cheeses that we developed after the caves, now that we had kind of some more space and, you know, a couple years after the cellars, we sort of still had open shelf space. So we invested in a second creamery. So Willoughby and Harbison today are actually made in the Vermont Food Venture Center, which is an incubator space in the nearest big town. It's like got a stoplight and a bank. And a food incubator. So if you have a berry farm, you can go there and make jam in a certified kitchen and then have access to resources to help you incubate your new business and launch your product, and then maybe get to a place where you could scale into your own facility. So that shared use space has a private section to it, and that's where our creamery is. So we're sort of the anchor tenant. We help sort of cover the overhead of that as that project develops. So we make our soft cheese down at the Vermont Food Venture Center, and Willoughby is another soft cheese that we're going to taste today. So this is Willoughby here. It's similar in texture to Harbison, not quite as gooey, so that it can stand up straight on its own. Doesn't have the spruce bark, but a really similar recipe otherwise. And something that's kind of interesting differentiation between the Harbison is that instead of growing the fluffy white rind on it, we are washing it with a salt brine. So excuse my little crumples here. Okay, so instead of that fluffy white rind, we are growing sort of a sticky, tacky rind that is doing a similar thing. It's contributing enzymes from the microbes that we're cultivating, and it's breaking down the fats and proteins, kind of releasing the water from that rubbery, spongy curd and creating a beautiful, soft, kind of gooey texture. But the aromas that you get are funkier. They're a little bit different than the bloomy rind family. So I mentioned bloomy rinds tend to go in the mushroomy, vegetal, garlicky direction, and a washed rind cheese is going to be more like funky, meaty, maybe fruity, think like peaches and apricots, and sometimes like spring onions, that kind of those kinds of flavors, maybe some scallions. So the bark is usually worse than the bite. This is the stinky cheese family. Like Limburger is probably the best known, or Epoisse, the French stinky cheese, and they are quite aromatic, quite funky, and like a little bit like, ooh, what am I smelling there? Is that food or what? But then once you eat it, it's much more mellow and gentle on the palate, and it kind of surprises you with like how balanced that flavor can be for how stinky it is. So if you're not familiar with wash rind family, this is another type of cheese that we're seeing more and more of these days as the American cheese movement like develops and sort of matures into its next phase. We're seeing more customers understanding and looking for the wash rind cheese family, and then more cheesemakers responding by offering that. And the American cheese making scene has really helped build that interest just by making the cheese they love and then doing the work of educating consumers about what to expect. And of course, you know, Europe has been helping us develop that market for centuries too. But, all right, so that Willoughby. And Willoughby is particularly, I would say, on the spectrum of funk, is kind of like middle to low on that spectrum. So it's a good gateway cheese. It's a good way to explore the style. It's not super overwhelming or assertive. It's really quite well balanced and meaty. This cheese, Michael's just about to say, well, what would you pair this one with? So I love this one with a funky sour beer or a dry cider, maybe like slightly off dry cider, but hard ciders are also having a moment right now. And washed rind cheeses and hard cider is just like a lovely combination. They balance each other really well. It helps bring out the fruitiness of the cheese. Especially if you have a cider with a little bit of effervescence, those bubbles help kind of clean up the palate from the very rich and gooey texture of the cheese. So that's a combo to keep an eye out for. All right, Highlander is an Alpine style cheese, like I mentioned. So when I talk about cheese making in the Alps, part of it is, you know, we're mimicking those dry hay pastures, but also in the Alps, they used to take the cows up out of the lowlands so they could grow crops down below. So they bring the cows to the places where they couldn't grow crops, where the cows could harvest those beautiful alpine meadows, grasses, high alpine grasses. And then they would have to like make cheese sort of while camping. They'd have these like wooden huts, and they would, you know, take the whole village's cows up there, milk them twice a day, and make like a cheese after each milking. One big cheese, like Comte and Gruyere, like 80-pound wheels, and they're like 4 feet across. And it was the size of the bottom of the copper cauldron they were making the cheese in. And they would do that because a nice big cheese lasts a long time. They're trying to make food for the winter. They're kind of like easier to store instead of like juggling all of these little wheels. And they were, you know, stocking the larders of the village instead of making little cute cheeses that you could go and sell at a market one at a time. So that the big format worked for them. And in order to get a big cheese dry enough so that it wouldn't kind of like rot in the middle, they needed to get moisture out of the curd, and kind of the fastest way to do that in your wooden hut on the side of a mountain is to build a fire under your cauldron. Cooking the curd helps dry it down, helps kind of like shrink them up and squeeze out the moisture. And it also imparts kind of like a cooked cheese flavor. And that fast make results in not a lot of acidity being produced during cheese making. When you make cheese, you're turning the lactose, the sugar in cheese, into lactic acid with your starter cultures. And the longer your make process, the more tangy and acidic your cheese gets, and the more crumbly the texture gets. And so a quicker make tends to be less acidic, sweeter, and more bendy. I mentioned, you know, the longer the make, the more acidity, the more crumbly it gets. You're dissolving away the calcium glue in a more acidic make that gives you this nice elastic texture. So this wedge of cheese, let's see if I can give you an impression. It doesn't crumble and break. It really bends. This is a beautifully bendy cheese. And in fact, at a certain point in the make process, we wash away some of the whey with that active lactose making acid and replace it with just plain warm water to kind of slow down the acidity. It's called a washed curd cheese. So this is kind of a medium elevation cheese. That the recipe and the technique and the texture we're going for is really similar to raclette, the French cheese that you would put half wheels under an iron from the fire and melt the surface and scrape it onto a plate of potatoes and pickles and charcuterie. It's a great suggestion of what to do with Highlander. Get yourself some like delicious prosciutto and some cornichon and crusty bread or boiled potatoes, and that's like a whole dinner. What more do you need? So Highlander is our first cheese made with, one of our first cheeses made with goat's milk. So you see these cute goat faces here. Annie and Ryan are goat farmers. They were in California. They were actually worked for years for one of the pioneers of the American goat cheese movement, Cypress Grove. And Cypress Grove got to a certain point in their business. They wanted to build this big, beautiful, well-scaled, modern goat farm. And Annie and Ryan, Ryan in particular worked directly for Cypress Grove, helped them get that farm designed and built and run and dialed in. And then there came a point where Ryan really, you know, wanted kind of his own stake in the game, wanted his own farm. He'd been keeping an eye on a herd of goats in Vermont. And he noticed when they went up for sale, because the family wanted to retire, the Oak Knoll Dairy in Windsor, Vermont. And this herd of goats is beautifully bred genetics-wise, very low incidence of any of the sort of problems you can have with goats. 3 different breeds sort of mixed together, a closed herd, meaning that the genetics are staying from within. And so they took the plunge, moved to Vermont for the opportunity to work with these goats. We wanted to make goat cheeses. We have had a farm in town that had just gone out of business. We wanted to make sure it didn't go away forever or get developed. And so we went 50-50 with them. We bought the goats and the old cow farm, and then we worked together with them to adapt it for goats. And so now we have a source of goat milk. We still sell bottled milk the way that the old farm was doing, but any extra milk goes into cheese. So this is a 50-50 goat cow blend. And I like the combo because you get the goatiness, which is like an interesting kind of like meaty, sometimes it reminds me of like chestnut honey flavor, buckwheat honey. It's a kind of almost like a leathery note in a way. It's goaty. It's like the only way to describe it. But the cow's milk brings you that richness. Goat's milk is really lean. It can be hard to make like a supple, rich textured cheese. So this cheese I think is a great, it has like a little caramely sweetness, really rich taste, very nutty. I think it's a lovely match with a pale ale, with a lighter bodied red wine, or with a bold white wine. So a lot of pairing possibilities. It's also excellent with cider. Cider and cheese is just so good together. Bayley Hazen Blue, the last cheese that we're going to taste today, is another raw milk cheese. And this is one of the first cheeses that was made at Jasper Hill back in 2003. It's kind of our flagship. And we have since not only graduated our soft cheeses to that tip-up system I talked about from that kind of like round starter vat, but also we have invested in a blue cheese vat, which is sort of this long half pipe. It's beautiful to watch this curd form. So you set the curd with, first you acidify, right, with the starter cultures. You start turning that sugar into acid. That's kind of loosening up the little protein bundles. And then you add your rennet, which is a coagulant, and it does its magic and helps your proteins kind of stick to each other. And then you've got basically a big vat of jello, it's like yogurt, a big yogurty vat. It's kind of sitting there. You let it set until the perfect moment when it has the right amount of body and firmness. And then you go through with these knives. It's more like a harp or a set of wires. And all at once you do this sideways swipe. And then you've got all of these kind of half moon wiggly bits of yogurt. And then you cut it the other direction. And then you end up with these like long, actually first you do the long ribbons. So you send a harp from one end of the half pipe to the other, and then you have like a vat full of spaghetti, and then you go in and you cut it sideways, and then you end up with these perfect little jet puff marshmallow shaped curds. And the difference in consistency and the perfection of each individual curd is so much improved from when we were trying to make it in a round vat, where you can never really make a round shape into perfect little squares. There's always like kind of the cornery bits. And for blue cheese in particular, it's very important to have consistent curd size and texture, because you're trying to pile up those curds into a cylindrical form, perforated so it can kind of drain. You can see this conveyor belt. There's even a timing setting on that, so it can drain on the belt and get to the top when it's at the perfect texture, and it kind of spills over into the forms. And then you want it to stand up straight after you take it out of the forms, but you also don't want it to be too dense and collapse. You want it to have an airy, open texture, like the crumb of a bread. And with blue cheese in particular, it's the trickiest cheese to make, because you're making a mold ripened cheese, like a surface ripened cheese, like a bloomy rind. Same cousin to the fluffy white mold, it's just fluffy blue mold, but you're making it inside out. You're like making an inside out soft ripened cheese. And you can't do that if there isn't room for that blue to grow, and if there isn't oxygen for that blue to breathe. So you have to make this form that's going to keep its shape and keep its open pockets. And then you spike it with a stainless steel spike. And the blue mold spores that we add to the milk phase, who've just been chilling dormant until they get into the caves, all of a sudden get a breath of fresh air when you spike it. They start to grow and develop and ripen the cheese. So every once in a while, it's only happened once that I can remember in my 12 years at Jasper Hill, where we've missed a wheel and we forgot to poke it. And at the end, you cut it open and it's totally white. No blue at all has formed. And it's like chalky and acidic and boring, doesn't really taste like anything. It's just kind of salty. Like, it's more like feta than like a fudgy, bold, slightly spicy blue cheese like it should be. And so that really transforms the textures, makes it like a fudgy, silky texture. And it, like I said, just gives it that interesting depth of flavor. So our Ayrshire cows, our brown and white spotted cows, we think they're the perfect cows for blue cheese because they have naturally petite fat globules. So the little blobs of fat in the milk are especially small. They stay evenly dispersed, and blue mold is really fat hungry. It likes to eat the fats, break them down, and turn them into those anise spice black licoricey aromas. And so Bayley Hazen Blue is known as being very flavorful, but also very balanced. And we think those small fat globules that stay evenly dispersed and are small and spread out lead to a less like spicy and assertive blue. And it's more just like it's cheesy and toasty and buttery first. And then it's a more subtle anise spice note. It's not as aggressive as like a Roquefort, which is made from sheep's milk, which is super fatty. And there's a lot of fuel for that blue mold to eat. And it has Roquefort has a more dense bluing because the openness is like a little bit more frequent than Bayley. So Bayley, a good batch of Bayley, you can tell because it has nice big areas of whiteness, and then, you know, a little bit less blue interspersed, and that just helps create a more balanced experience. Blue cheese tends to, as I mentioned, it's like a little bit spicy. It's usually salty, and undersalted blue cheese just isn't right. It doesn't go good. So there's usually other problems associated with like an undersalted blue. So the blue style tends to be a little saltier, a little spicier. And with all soft ripened cheeses, including blue, you tend to get a mild bitterness, and you wouldn't really pick up on the bitterness if you're enjoying it alone. Some blues are noticeably bitter, like in a pleasant way, like endive or, you know, green vegetables. But you notice it when you try to pair it with a bitter beverage, or you know, I would avoid like a marmalade with that pithy bitterness, because when you put bitter on bitter, it's not pleasant. It kind of becomes overwhelming, where any one of the two things is in balance. When you put them together, it knocks itself out of balance. So I would suggest something off dry. That's why blue cheeses are often paired with like port and sauterne and ice ciders or ice wines, dessert wines. Blue cheese and dessert wines is just like the most indulgent and beautiful way to end a meal. It's like the sweet and the salty and the bitter, and a good dessert wine also has a nice acidity too. It kind of rounds out that whole experience. So that's a nice way to go. Also, like porters and stouts, especially if they have a little bit of that caramely taste, can be a lovely match with blue. But also blue is the most surprising cheese when we do pairings. We often will design a pairing on paper based on our experience, based on what we know are going to match well, based on the sensory attributes that we've detected in either the style of beverage or the cheese that we know well. And then blue's always a wild card, where we're like, oh, that's not going to work. And just for fun, we try it and we're like, whoa, weird. This blue actually went really well with that Chardonnay. I thought it would be way too assertive, but somehow it held its own. So it's really fun cheese to experiment and try different styles and pairings. And often if you find one that's not great, blue can like clash as well as it can harmonize. It's instructive. It teaches you something about pairing. It's about like what could go wrong. So I love to always include blue cheese in a pairing class for that reason. So Michael's put together an awesome series of content for this month. If this is the first one that you've tuned in for, I highly encourage you to check out the other ones that he's put together. I'm going to do two more, one pairing chocolate and wine, and the other bourbon and some charcuterie. So we've got a lot of fun stuff coming down the pike. And you're also able to order a tasting set from Jasper Hill. That's going to be the same cheeses that we're going to use in different settings. So this was the story of Jasper Hill and the artisan cheese movement. And then in the pairing classes, we're really going to dive deep into the sensory properties of each cheese and pair them with other things. So you can pick up that tasting kit at jasperhillfarm.com/shop. And then there's a link to that specific tasting kit for these classes. So I'm so happy to be able to be here today to share the story of Jasper Hill and my love of cheese, obviously. And thanks for supporting American Cheese Month and American cheese producers all over the country. I hope you have a lot of fun tasting and learning more about it. Thank you so much, Michael, for having me.